Well, Dave, you and I have known each other for a few years now, and 1,000 years, a millennium. Yep.
Millennium.
And I think we first started working together when you were working on one of our courses at UXCC, and over time we've worked on more things, and it's been really great getting to know you and work with you, because I think you have not only a unique approach to content and the industry in general, but also you have a joyful disposition that I find very relaxing and easy to be around. So just to start off with, why don't you introduce yourself and tell people what you're doing now and maybe a little bit about your career history?
Yes. So I'm Dave Connis. I am the lead content designer at OutSystems, which is a low-code platform builder. So you bring your data and you build a UI over it, basically. I am on the design system team. I was not always on the design system team, but I am currently on the design system team. I've been on there for about a year and a half now, and it's been wonderful. It's where my brain really works, so I'm really glad to be there. And it's been a kind of a roundabout way to get there. My entire career has been based around more technical products. So I started off as this is loose UX developer. This is a really generous term. I really was just trying. I was trying is all it was. And was around the technical side of things pretty early on. Even when I started at tech, I kind of skipped all of the introductions and just went straight into GitHub. And then it just kind of kept rolling that way. I got a job as a technical writer, and then as a technical writer at another low-code platform. And as a technical writer, I started noticing man, I have to carry the weight of really bad UI as I explain how to do stuff in here. Why do I have to say it this way? If we could just change this thing in here in the UI, then I wouldn't have to write 10 sentences trying to work around how to explain how to do this. So that kind of led me, and this was 2016. So it was kind of right as UX writing was starting to be talked about. But that led me to a whole thing about, I'm going to put down all of the strings that we have in our product, and I'm going to make this big database, and I'm going to try and track all of the strings and get the developers to change it. It was UX. It was UX writing, content design, content strategy stuff, but nobody, it's not somebody told me about it. It's just that's where my brain went. So I forget what happened. The first time I heard about UX writing, I was like, wait a minute, hold on 1 second. And ever since, it just I was like, yep, there it is. Boom. So from there, I went to a security company that was really technical, was for developers. Learned about the horrors of computer security, and became as cynical as all the devs about how nothing is safe ever, which is great. And then I came to OutSystems, and it's just been developers-focused work ever since.
Does that mean you don't have a Ring camera on your house or any type of connected device?
That is what that means. Yes. There was a guy in college that I was really close with, and he was a computer engineer. And he was a computer engineer as a freshman. So I had no idea what he was doing with his life, obviously more than I was, because I was playing Halo and he was engineering programs. But I walk in and he's got a Post-it note on his webcam. And this is the first time I'd ever heard of anything. I was like, what are you doing? He was like, dude. And I was like, I don't know if I want to go down this road. But anyway.
I should probably pay more attention to internet security with all the stuff I own. But anyway, that's a whole other tangent. It doesn't matter. But I think
that is literally the word I got from all the devs when I was working with them. I was like, oh, well, what if you just did this? And they're like, doesn't matter. They can do this.
They can do this.
Well, what if you locked yourself in an impenetrable vault in Antarctica? Doesn't matter.
They'll get in somehow.
Yep.
one the we've talked before on the podcast about the difference between technical writing and UX writing, and people going from technical writing to UX writing. But I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed learning from you is about how not only how the two are pretty intrinsically linked, but also how the two really complement each other, in the sense that we often say, like, oh yeah, technical writers should learn UX writing skills and blah blah blah, but we often don't talk about it like the other way. And actually, a lot of UX writers and content designers could actually do well to dive into technical writing and what that involves, and
Yeah.
the skills involved, because it
Yep.
is a slightly different muscle that you need to use. And I think you have a good sense of which skills complement the other. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've talked a little bit about how you gain more about knowledge about UX writing, but how these two can really help each other in sort of bettering their practice.
Yeah. I'll start with who do I want to start with? Who do I want to pick on first? I'll start with technical writing first, because
The nerds.
yeah, we're all nerds. One of the things that is really beneficial about doing technical writing is that you learn, at least I learned, I don't know if everybody's this way, but you learn how to break apart concepts and define them fairly early, because people are going to your docs both to troubleshoot, right? They have a problem and they need to solve it. So they need to understand what the product is and where all these things fit in your system. And then the second thing is also just to understand and to learn, right? And in all of those cases, you have to say, hey, this thing that is in the product, this is what it is. And this is how it interacts with the rest of the system. And I think that is like a really beneficial thing to think about as you're designing, because you don't necessarily have to do that as a UX writer. You're kind of just writing, right? Like you're focusing on smaller copy. You're focusing on how to say things with the least amount of words, which is a challenge in its own right. But when you don't have to do that and you have to write out like everything that's in a UI and how it works, it forces you to think about it in a completely different way, especially as it relates to the system, because you're also paying attention to cross-linking, right? Like you have to, you're putting links into like, this is where this part comes in over here, and that's naturally happening. So you're thinking about the whole ecosystem that way, even if you're kind of doing docs for a specific thing. And I think it just sets your brain up fairly well to write for ecosystems versus kind of just write for a specific domain. So that's where I've seen the huge benefit is technical writers, if they've been in a place for a long time, they're so freaking knowledgeable. One of the best technical writers I knew literally coded his own onboarding experience and wrote all the content for it. And like, that's a whole nother level. It's just like, it was amazing. But like, there are technical writers that can do that, right? So there's a wealth of knowledge there, because it forces you to understand also the dev cycle, because you're also a little bit tighter with devs, because devs understand technical writers, right? It's a very clear, it's been around for a long time. So devs are like, yeah, I know what you do. It's a little bit harder on the other side with UX writing. So there's a clear relationship between technical writing and engineers working with engineers. On the UX side, I would say for technical writers, UX writing helps you kind of understand user need, and then it helps you understand what's appropriate, and it helps you understand language, because you're coming at it from like a knife perspective, right? Like you're trying to get the stuff out of the way that gets in the user's way, to keep the user from understanding it. A lot of times I think technical writers can get bogged down in well, I'm a technical writer, therefore I will use utilize versus just use. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I think the simplicity and the meet the user where they are and the empathy of the UX writing can have a lot to say to the technical writing space.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just go together really well, and I would love to see more of a marriage between the two. I've thought about it a lot at OutSystems because I haven't had a chance to work with technical writing yet. We're kind of like ships passing in the night always. But also cross collaborative work there takes a lot. It just takes a lot. So
Yeah.
But I think it's possible, and I definitely think it's beneficial, mutually beneficial for each group.
The systems thinking workshop that you've been running has received, I think, some of the best reviews for a workshop that I've ever seen. And not only that, but I've seen people on LinkedIn talking about it. And recently, someone in a Slack group asked, it doesn't feel like there's a lot new happening in UX writing or content design in terms of, concepts. And someone mentioned your work in systems thinking as one of the few examples as pushing the industry forward with really new concepts and new ideas about how we should be going about our work. And obviously, systems thinking is not a new thing, and it's certainly not specific to content. But the way you've approached it within content, I think, is quite unique. I'd love if you could just give a quick rundown or overview of how you approach systems thinking as it relates to content, and why you think it's an important thing for content designers and UX writers to understand.
Yeah. So I think the big thing is it's all content, right? So like in a UI, you have a screen that is filled with stuff, and we could call all of that stuff content, even the boxes, but we're specifically thinking about the words within it. The thing that has really kind of shaped my understanding of all of this is that those words are tied to things within the code, right? It's not just, you're not just writing stuff. You're not just writing messages. You are representing things that are in your like GitHub repo. So that was kind of the first realization for me of like, oh, there's something more going on here. And then you add in this idea of how humans make sense of things, which is like, grouping things, relationships, models. If you look at all of the UX laws, it's all about just trying to make sense of stuff. And words play a big part in that. And words are actually representations of things. So I worked with a taxonomist my first year at OutSystems. And she was really instrumental in showing me around like, hey, words are representing something. They're representing a concept. There are ideas that we need to represent that, like, without a word, you can't do it. So all of these things play a part in how a user approaches a UI. And I couldn't find anything that was trying to marry them all together. And I was like, well, somebody will probably write it eventually, and I'll just wait, and then I'll take the course. And it just never came up. So finally I was like, okay, fine, I'll try and do it. And it was hard. It was really difficult to try and, like, this sentence that I am saying now in however many minutes I've said has taken a lot of time and thinking in order to say it this quickly. So they're just like all of these fundamental parts that are going on. And I think it's really easy, specifically with, I see this all the time with user stories, where as a user, I want so that I can, and that just like blocks out ecosystem thinking because you're so focused on the domain and on the feature that you have to build, which is, I understand, like, you have to build the thing, right? So it's not that that's a bad thing. It's just like, when you're doing these user stories, you're reading a sentence within a chapter, and you're not looking at the rest of the chapter. You're not even looking at the rest of the book. You don't have to. Like, nobody's asking you to do that. So, and you can get away with it. You can get away with it a lot of times, not looking at the rest of the book. But that the user feels that. So That's kind of all of the things that combined in order to push me towards this idea of like, what does it look like to systems think with content at the forefront, content focus. What do I call it? I don't know. I can't even remember. Content first systems thinking. I need my slides.
One of the things that I've been a little bit concerned about is people seeing design systems as goals in and of themselves. And what I think that your work gets across is the type of work we're doing here with systems thinking to understand these concepts and give them names and so on, and to think about it as a system is good, but the end goal is not to create a design system. The end goal is to empower the work being created.
Yeah.
I don't know if you to take umbrage with that, but I don't know. I've just seen it popping up now and again where it's like, the design system is the goal. It's the goal. It's not the goal. The product is the goal. The design system is a means to get there.
Yeah. That's actually really interesting. I've not put my thoughts down yet on how all of this works with design systems, which is funny because that's like what I do in my everyday. So I have thoughts. It's just like this sort of system thinking work does lend itself to design system thinking. But a lot of times people, I think, mess up the idea of like, well, okay, so if you're systems thinking, that means you're what are you doing? Design system? And it's like, it's a part of it. It's not the whole deal. It's similar to content strategy, right? Like it all kind of informs itself and informs each other. But like the cool thing about when you think about content from a structural level, shout out to all my content modelers out there. When you think about content from a structural level, and then you think about patterns and how it repeats in a UI, those things are, you can model those within a design system. So like, the big thing that, OutSystems is a huge product. It's been around for 20 years now, maybe even longer. So there's a lot of legacy stuff. It still has patterns though. And it's not even just on the visual patterns, like here's a header, here's the description. It's about like, what is the job that content is doing? So I've been like kicking around this idea of the jobs of content, and I'm not going to remember all of them, but I think in my brain, there's 5. And I think it's ask, sell, represent. This is going to be really disappointing for everybody if I don't get all 5. I feel a lot of pressure right now. Ask, sell, represent, inform, educate, and then I think potentially warn.
Well, that's 6.
Okay, so cool. We'll just go with that. But basically, the idea is
a bonus one.
If you see content, it is doing a job. If you're writing content, it has a job. So there are only so many jobs we're going to ask of content within a UI. We're not reinventing the system. So the idea, I'm going to focus on the representation. So think about a card, right? What is a card doing? It is representing a data object. Like that is what a card does. As a component in a design system, it's not going to be used for much else. There might be some kind of things here and there, but like when you see a gallery and you have a card within it, it's all about the object that it's representing. So if you think about the text in a card header, it's highly likely, I would put money on the fact that is going to be the name of the name of the object. So in OutSystems, you have apps. If you have a card for each app instance, it's going to be, my monkey app or whatever. Come up with your app name, right? So that text, that header, its job is to represent, because we are representing the object that is being shown in that card. So if you can break content down like that and start looking at what is the job doing, and then what is the structure of this, you can start creating kind of content structures within design system components. And like, I'm just kind of starting to mess around with all of that, but it's been incredibly powerful because it really gets you down to like, okay, we're only going to ask so many things of this component. So how can we like actually structure this content wise so that it kind of does its best within the system that we have?
I think the one reaction you could have to something like this is you could have like, oh, it's approaching content in a very sort of clinical way, and it's maybe taking away like some of the creative aspect to it. But I actually don't see it that way. I see it in the same way that when you have a sentence in on the board in elementary school and you have to circle the nouns, circle the verb, what's the subject, what's the
Yeah.
object. It's a
Oh,
very similar
sentence diagramming.
approach.
Sentence diagramming. Yeah.
What? Sorry, what did you say?
Sentence diagramming. I think that's what it was called.
Right,
Yep.
yeah. And it's just a very similar, it's a very similar approach, and it means that you can then, according to your system and your product and so on, you can then scale things much easier if you
Yeah.
have a repeatable pattern for the way you're approaching this content.
Yeah.
I actually think it enhances creativity, but I don't know.
I mean, if you think about, so I write children's books in my spare time. So one of the biggest things that I've been learning recently is just like all of the things that go together to create a good book, right? So if you think about the fact that like in order to tell a story, you need to have a plot that goes through the entire book that makes sense to people. Brandon Sanderson, fantasy author, has his own underground bunker. Google it; it's true. He really does. He built an underground bunker.
Yep.
Wow. But he has this framework called promise, payoff, and progress. So the idea is like at the beginning of a book, you're making promises. And if you get to the middle of the book and you're not progressing on those promises, people are going to be mad. If you get to the end of the book and your payoff has nothing to do with the promise you made, nobody's going to like it, right? Writing for product is the same way. You are making promises when you get into a product where this is the thing that you can do with our product. You see it on Airbnb. If you look down at the nav, it's trips, right? So we're promising you will be able to book a trip. If you go through a UI and you're not delivering progress on those promises and you're just making it really confusing, like you get to the end and the payoff's just kind of like, meh. And you might not even get to the end. You might just not even finish it. So, I say all that because it's like, if we think about just writing from a progression standpoint, I think people have created frameworks for doing this thing. I mean, the hero's journey, Star Wars, like people have frameworks for all this because it helps you, move things forward, move the story forward. And I think that's all that product writing is it's just a form of storytelling. But you have all this other stuff going on with, the like mental models and representation and all that stuff. So you got to take that into account and understand those rules in order to tell the story of a product.
But I think Brandon Sanderson is actually a really great example. So people listening who don't read fantasy novels are probably like, what the hell are these guys talking about? But like Brandon Sanderson is a really good example because he is one of the most successful fantasy authors. And I think this is a good direct link to the types of systems thinking we're talking about with UX content because he is a very methodical writer.
Yeah.
And he breaks down the structure of his novels, point by point by point by point by point. He is a very plot-driven writer. Very similar to what we were just describing in terms of, you have your card and then you have your piece of, you have your heading, and that heading is labeled in, our systems thinking process as a representative piece of text. And then there might be some descriptive piece of text or whatever, and so you're labeling things like that. It's also a very methodical approach. I think the variable that comes in is that some people like myself read Brandon Sanderson's novels and can't stand them. And I think that
I did not realize at the beginning of this that you hated Brandon Sanderson.
I don't like his novels at all. When Vidica Bouncel was on, I think it was Vidica or was someone else. Brandon Sanderson has come up on this podcast before,
Okay.
funnily enough. But I think it's interesting though, because it leads to this question of having a system and everything is one part of it. You need to still marry that with the
Yeah.
concepts of
Yep.
voice and tone and
Yep.
creativity. It's not
You
just
do.
like, cool, we've got a system, we can scale it, it's fine. You still need to inject it with everything that you are that makes your brand or your voice
Yep.
memorable.
Yep.
So, you still, and look, I'm not crapping on people who like Brandon Sanderson. I just happen not to like it. But it's just
I have
saying that,
no
like,
opinion. I've only read a few of them, and they're fine. I'm not a huge fantasy reader, so
yeah. It's yeah, I just think that sometimes I think people or content designers don't like to think about systems thinking, or even the connection between technical writing and UX writing too much, because for many people they come from creative writing backgrounds and it can suck the creativity out of it. But to be honest, I think there's a huge amount of creativity and fun in making systems and connecting
yeah,
things together
yeah.
and managing those things as a whole. And then, because all great creativity is comes from a restrictive environment. No creativity can't exist necessarily just from freedom. You have to have some sort of restrictive element to it. I mean, that's how writing prompts work. It's
I
the
have a perfect example here. So for a
take it
long
away.
time, I just showed up and I wrote. I didn't do any prep. This was so not product writing, book writing. So I showed up. I didn't do any prep. I had a kind of like some vague ideas of what I wanted to do,
Hmm.
and then I ended up having kids. Not ended up. I had kids. There was decisions made. I had children. They're very wonderful, but they changed things, right? And then I was writing without a full time job, and then I got a full time job. So I had a full time job, and I had kids, and then I had all these restrictions on my time. And
Hmm.
writing, it took me a long time to realize, like, I can't just show up and be like, who knows what's going to happen anymore. I
Right.
didn't have the capacity to do it, and I couldn't understand why I just wasn't getting along with writing. So finally, I was like, okay, I got to figure something out. And I figured out that, like, when I got to my little sliver of hour of time to write, I couldn't make any massive, like, I was always making massive creative decisions in that hour because I
Hmm.
never knew what I was going to do because I didn't do any of the work up front. I revised my whole process. I now have like a really heavy front loaded. I do all of my research. I do all of my themes. I like write out my themes, and then I do all of my synopsis. I used to think that people who did that were ridiculous and they took all the fun out of everything. I just finished a book using that process. It is one of the best things that I have written. And I think it is the most connected thing that I have written. And it
Hmm.
is the most creative thing that I have written because I took out so much of this like creative wanderiness. And this is just my experience. It gave me some bounds and some things to lean on to say, like, okay, I know that I need to do X, Y, and Z. And it just like took away some decisions for me so that I could focus on like all of the creative bits. And I feel
Hmm.
like that approaching content for me has been this way. Is
Hmm.
like if I can have something to lean on where I'm not constantly trying to reinvent the wheel or constantly like trying to understand how I'm thinking about this, like it has set me free to be able to focus on other things and to focus on like some of the more creative parts because I am not bogged down in trying to figure out what is actually going
Hmm.
on. So anyway, that's a long example, but it like I think write the synopsis if you're writing a book. Just write the synopsis. You'll be all right. You'll survive.
Yeah.
So,
I wanted to ask you maybe a little bit of a spicy question, but I have been thinking more this year about the progress of UX writing as an industry and where it's going. And I think that the last 2 years have been really interesting because ChatGPT came out, all of these models followed, and in the initial aftermath of that, there were all of these job losses that were happening all around the same time. And for a lot of people, that was a pretty devastating time, not only because they lost their jobs, and there are still some people who haven't been able to enter the industry again. What has happened since then, though, is that a lot of companies have now started hiring. I mean, I've seen companies that laid people off now hiring people back at lower
Cool.
salaries, but that's a different
Love it.
topic.
Yeah.
And there has been I think maybe not a resurgence, but certainly a sense of optimism that more people are being hired. Our industry was not destroyed. We are still here. We're doing interesting things, but I do think that it's interesting to note that in other disciplines like development, where you have constant new libraries or efficiencies or ways of doing work that are happening, I do feel like in some ways UX writing and content design can be a little stuck in the mud. And
Mhm.
I like that person who mentioned on Slack, it doesn't feel like there's new or interesting things happening. And I think it's because people aren't sharing their work enough. I think a lot of the stuff in content that's happening is really under the hood, and I'm not seeing people write interesting blog posts or case studies or whatever about it. And I'm getting a little frustrated about it because I really wish people would share more about what they were doing. I'm curious, not necessarily if you agree with that or not, but I'm just wondering, like, what's your assessment of the industry right now
Mm.
and where we are and where we're going?
Yeah. I think this is such a layered question. I definitely have felt frustration in similar ways. Like we're writing the same articles over and over again. I think I've felt that way. Um, I also know um, I've talked about this with writers, and some writers have said like, "Yeah, I'm on too many work streams to have time to write."
Hmm.
Like I'm spread thin because we have a content designer product designer ratio of like a bajillion to a half. Or one of the things that I've picked on a lot lately is all of these big design conferences and no content design representation.
Hmm.
Like Figma this year, Config didn't have any content designers.
Hmm.
And I picked on them a little bit, and I forget what they said, but they were like, yeah, we'll try harder. But like a bunch of people came out of the woodwork and said, yeah, I submitted a really good talk for this.
Hmm.
So I think there is that level of things where it's like I think there is some obstacles to content designers getting there. I also think at the same time that we are our own worst enemy.
Hmm.
I've seen that a lot just in a lot of my careers, my one career, a lot of my jobs, where we just get so stuck in the ideal way that things should be. Like,
Hmm.
we need to do it this way. We need to say this way. We need to, like, I think we are not very flexible. And I think I think when it comes down to it, if you look at a developer and say, are you going to work on this feature or change all of these things to sentence case?
Hmm.
No developer is going to say sentence case.
Yeah.
Like, I think sometimes we have an inflated importance of some of our like things that we stand on.
Hmm.
And in the reality, they just don't match with business objectives and they just don't go to business goals. Um, So like the sentence case thing, yes. If would it be awesome if all of our things matched? Awesome. Yes, that would be great. Is it going to happen? Probably not. We
Hmm.
have too many other things to work on. So like I think when I see things like those sorts of things where it's like that's what we can offer is we should do things all sentence case. I think we can offer more than that.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways it's like, I just want people to offer more than that. Like, like, I think in some ways we've inherited the deliverables of marketing, but we've not necessarily translated them to product or understood how like they feel in product, because marketing is all about the style guide, right? Like style guide in marketing, style guide in product, like those two things, that's kind of what we inherited it from. And I think we're still really struggling with the fact that, hey, we aren't marketing. We're doing something else here. What is that? And I really, really like, I think for me, the style part, yes, it's important. At the end of the day, if we are fighting about commas, nobody's going to listen to us.
Yep.
It's just not going to happen. So I think we need to get really practical and like really focused on what matters, because I don't think it's sentence case. I don't think it's commas. I don't think it's like all of the things that not all of the things, but a lot of the things that we fight about. And that's my spicy hot take is I think we're looking at the wrong stuff a lot of times based on what I see put out there. Even in some cases, and this is the spiciest take, tone. I think we get bogged down in tone a lot. And like, I forget who wrote it, but there's a article that's there is no tone, there is only context.
Mm-hmm.
I think that like that is a really good thought, and to think about how we can not be so. I'm gonna get in trouble. I'm gonna get kicked out of content design. Yes, tone is like tone. Getting the tone is right and appropriate, and we need to match. That is such a marketing fight, right? Like marketing has always been about the tone and getting the brand voice and all that stuff. That is true in a product, but there, in my opinion, is something more important, and that's getting the user to the end goal. Like tone has something to do with that. It's not the end goal. So anyway, before I like get kicked out of content design,
I share your frustration, because there are very few things I care less about than like the Oxford comma, and I just can't get into another debate about it. But the thing that I find especially frustrating is, so every week I go and collect articles for our newsletter, The Dash, and I look around at the blog articles being written. Why microcopy matters, why UX writing is important for your product, and I'm just like, and look, there are people doing a really great job of this. I think the Button Conference has had some really great talks on very specific and deep things. I know that's a focus for them, and they're really great. The same thing with it was the other conference this year, Growing in Content, and that had a lot of really great case studies and examples. And
I think the hard part about that is that it's all content designers, which is good, but like I think for me, it's like I want to see that at Figma. I want to see that at Config.
Yes, exactly.
You know what I mean? Because
maybe you should submit a talk about your systems thinking approach to config. But yeah, I definitely agree. I think there needs to be more, but also one frustrating thing is you speak to we just published an article about someone who created a formula for maximum character widths, taking into maximum character lengths for specific components, specifically buttons, as it relates to localization. So it's like, if you're writing this, then your maximum character width is going to be whatever. And I'm just 100%. Like, I said on LinkedIn, I'm like, give me more. I want people writing more of this. I want people who work in legal saying, this is how we designed this particular form, or this is how we explored the language of this thing, or this is how I worked with developers on this tool. I just want more of it. And I just think we need to be more mature. And I think the way you approach systems thinking, I think, is a really great stepping stone to that. And these types of advanced concepts are what we need, more so, I think, than the introductory or surface level debate of like sentence versus title case or whatever.
Content designers are so valuable because they're looking at the words. We're just like so close to getting
Yeah.
to that. You know what I mean? Like I feel it that we're so close to getting to that like connection to the concepts and all of that stuff. Like I feel like that is just like one of the biggest values that we can offer.
Yeah.
And I'm obviously biased, right? Like, so I know that there's other value, but I think for like, I have seen scaling concepts, scaling terms, definitions, like all of those things are always really hard. They're just always going to be hard. Getting people aligned is always going to be hard on like what something means. Representing something the best way is always going to be hard. Like that, I think that is always going to be a pain point. I think we could just like, it isn't even that, like you might have to show the value once. As soon as you do it once, people are like, oh, yeah, I want that. Like I want that. I've seen it. I've seen it happen. And I
Like I
think
have
content
this,
designers are so there. Like they're already there. It's
yeah,
just like a shift to the left a little bit or the right.
I have this grand idea. I may or may not keep this in the podcast. So the thing I'm reacting to is content design is often reactive, not proactive. So we, in terms of like, we're so often at the whims of like, oh, our company, made this change and now we're laid off, or they put these restrictions on us, or these restrictions on us. I have this idea that we allow all sorts of customization in product for color and for settings and for workflows and for whatever. But for some reason, the industry has not adopted the practice of software that speaks to you in the way you want to be spoken to. So I have my Apple Watch, and when I get notifications about fitness, I like to be talked to in a certain way. So in the same
Mm.
way that I can choose whether I'm on dark mode or light mode or whatever, or in colorblind mode or whatever, why can't I choose that my product speaks to me in an encouraging way? Or why can't I choose a product that speaks to me like I don't know, like Michael Jordan when he's pissed off at the rest of his team and wants to really like light a fire under them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, why can't I? And why isn't that just an industry norm, right? And that's a silly example, but what I mean is that like I haven't seen content design as a whole push for not just industry wide shifts, but like device wide shifts, and I really think that we have it in us to make that impact. And I don't know, I feel like we should be pushing for it more, but maybe
Gotta
that's a
stop
blog
fighting our
post.
sense base.
I do want to write a blog post at one point, and that's basically like, you can change how your app looks. Why can't you change how it sounds? Because I do want that, and I'm sure if I want that, then others want it.
And other
But
people want it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, I think like the words always in, in my experience, words always tend to come at the last minute.
yeah,
And I think like it's
yeah,
just another one of those symptoms, right? Is that um, for some reason, while people see the value of marketing really clearly, it's tied to revenue, obviously, so that does
yeah,
something.
yep,
But like even in their testing, it's kind of always like, well, um, people see the value of technical writing. Like that's another industry niche, right? That people clearly see the value of. People see the value of product marketing, right? So you're kind of taking marketing, getting it closer to the product, to writing to specific audiences about that specific feature. Content design has had a big storytelling problem for how we bring value there. And I think, I think we can't be marketing. We can't be product marketing. And there are some really good content designers that do that. So it's not that's not like a value that we can bring, but I think there's just some space to figure out like, okay, how do we show revenue here? I'm hoping we will get there. I think we will. I mean, like the ironic thing is like the big breakout talk was that Google talk, right? About how they changed the word. You remember this? It was like 2017. They did a talk. They changed. I think it was like book now or something like that, and increased revenue. And that I think the hard part about that is the reality is that testing is hard. Like, not everybody can have event listeners on buttons that check that stuff. Like, getting metrics is really difficult for people because it takes custom work. It's work to get listeners in there.
Yeah.
In some ways, I'm looking down the pike of having to put those in myself, like figuring out what does it look like to structure all of this myself in order to get data. So like, I think that's a big challenge. I've been thinking about that a lot. Is just like some of the challenges of testing. I'm so envious of Shakespeare, which is Netflix.
Netflix,
dream over there. Like their whole spitting out tests, A/B tests. Like, yes, I want that. When somebody build it, I will give you maybe a child. I will not give you a child. But you know what I mean? Like, I think that like we have some innovation there that just needs to be unlocked. And to your point about pushing string files, everybody needs to get on the string file train. JSON string files, because there's a few products who have tried to kind of move towards this CMS type. There's not really a true product CMS because it's hard, because people don't use string files, right? Like the way that they're all built is all wonky. Like, it's different from place to place. Some stuff is in a string file, some isn't. If you are a writer and you are on a new feature and a new product or whatever, go to your dev team and just like try your hardest to get things working on a string file, because you open up the world for all of those sorts of possibilities where you can integrate with GitHub. You could likely have a CMS. Like, there are tons of ways to do that. And that is like one thing that I've just not seen talked about a lot, is like how so many people don't have string files, and how content designers could be the architects of those things, and like help engineers figure out how that works.
I mean, you can do so much more interesting things, but it's such a huge technical issue.
It is.
You know, it's like a huge undertaking to move from.
Yeah, because you have to extract all of those things. So I'm hoping in the near future that we can start, like, development best practice is extracting to string file.
Yeah. You're changing the world, Dave.
What can I say?
One workshop at a time. Well, one string at a time. Excellent. Side note: we were going to make merch at some point that said "I write strings, not tragedies" on a shirt. Shout out to Carly Gray for coming up with that. We never got around to it though. Look, we're pretty much out of time here, and I think we've managed to end things on a spicy take, which is always the way you want it.
Always.
Where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you or learn more from you?
I'm on LinkedIn, as is most content designers, so you can find me there. I'm also on Instagram. It just depends on what Dave you want. If you want like random normal Dave that talks about books and whatever and posts pictures of his kids, you can go to Instagram. If you want hot takes, or not even hot takes, just me being unprofessional in a professional setting, then you can follow me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
It's one of my favorite things to do.
Dave, it's always great talking to you. Thanks heaps for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Patrick. It's great.